Hello, it's Bobby Grow again. This will be a continuation of my last podcast. So this is part 2. My last podcast, if you listened to it, I hope you did, kind of cleared the ground, so to speak, for this podcast. And basically what I want to do, what I'm trying to do, is just introduce people who are unaware to my theological background, to the voices who I've allowed to speak into my life theologically. And maybe I haven't even allowed them. Maybe they've just spoken into my life without my permission. And so to speak. And so, I grew up. Let's just start kind of where I left off. We left off with me talking about me leaving or graduating Multnomah Biblical Seminary in 2003. And how I originally, though, so let's just get into my academic history. So, at the collegiate level and graduate level. So, I graduated high school. I went through Christian school all the way through my grammar, elementary, junior high, high school years. Graduated high school, 1992, and immediately that fall, after graduation, I attended Southwestern Bible College, or Southwestern College, it was called at that time, in Phoenix, Arizona, which is where my parents went to school and met. And so I just went there for a semester. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do in life at that point, so I was just kind of exploring. So I ended up going there for a semester, and it was very in keeping with my theological and ecclesiological family of origin, which I talked about in the last podcast, as far as a fundamentalist, conservative Baptist, kind of evangelical lifestyle, and existence. So Southwestern was just kind of an extension of that for me. It wasn't something foreign to me. The college life was, and being out on my own for the first time was. But so what I was really introduced to for the first time, though, which is interesting. I mean, I was introduced to some of this previously just through my dad, through his teaching, and because it was what he had been introduced to when he went to Bible college. So what I was introduced to, for example, in my systematic theology class there, 101, was our primary theological text was Charles Ryrie's Systematic Theology. And so that was the first systematic theology I read, and I was taught through his theology by an old school professor. And so that was just, some kind of seminal, I guess, exposure to systematic theology. If anyone has read Charles Ryrie or Charles Ryrie's Systematic Theology, you'll know that it's not all that critical of a systematic theology. It's very introductory level stuff and very vanilla, I guess. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, if you've read him, you know what I'm talking about. So anyways, that was my first exposure to systematic theology. And at that point, I liked it. And to be honest, I wasn't all that interested in that world. I really wasn't all that excited about school. I was a good student, but I just was kind of ready to be done with books and everything at that point. So like I mentioned, I left there, and just after a semester, I just went back home and started working, got a job, started working. But like I said in my last podcast, the Lord really introduced some crises into my life. And he used those to shape me. And so I ended up going after Calvary Chapel Bible College. I ended up going to Multnomah Bible College in Portland, Oregon. And again, it wasn't too unfamiliar to me, other than the fact that I'd never really been around professors until this point who had PhDs in theology. Southwestern had professors like that, but Multnomah, I mean, it was just way more academic than I'd ever experienced in my world theologically. And so that's where I was introduced really to systematic theology by some some good thinkers. Mike Gurney was a professor of mine who had he's more of a philosophical theologian. And so I took most of my systematic theology classes with him if I could. But our primary text was Millard Erickson. That was the school-wide text that was used for systematic theology, and then supplemented by Wayne Grudem. And Gurney supplemented that further with Bruce Demarest, their integrative theology, the guys out of Denver Seminary. So that was kind of my exposure to systematic theology in Bible college. And then I also did biblical studies, of course. But I'm just going to focus on theology, those influences in this podcast, because again, I don't have much time. So that's kind of what I worked through. I had, like I had mentioned in my other podcast, I was dealing with doubt, just a lot of the intellectual stuff. And it wasn't intellectual for me, it was causing major depression in my life and anxiety, like serious stuff. And so I was using theology in a way as a therapy. It was my therapy. That's what Bible college was for me. It was therapy, which is interesting to say that, but because it kind of fits into the whole seeker-sensitive kind of way of thinking. But that's really not what I'm referring to. I'm just saying that I had a major hole in my life, theologically, spiritually, intellectually. And so Multnomah, the Lord used Multnomah in a massive way to help me through that. And so I worked through all the apologetic stuff back then as well. William Lane Craig, J.P. Moreland, Mike Gurney himself, who was educated at Talbot School of Theology with J.P. Moreland. And just that whole movement of guys. And I got into intelligent design stuff with William Dembski, Philip Johnson, and the others in that field. Darwin's Black Box, Michael Behe, all those guys. So I was into that, even in Bible college. And it helped a little bit, but really the doubt that I was dealing with wasn't really being assuaged. It wasn't really being extinguished. And so it wasn't really, so that's kind of where I left off when I graduated Bible college in 2001. So it wasn't until I hit seminary in 2002 when I was introduced to historical theology for the first time. And that's what I needed. I needed historical theology. Historical theology saved my life. It saved my sanity. The Lord used it to meet that hole in my life. I did not realize the depth and the riches that were available in the history of the church, that God had provided for in Christ, as Jesus said, that he would not leave us as orphans, that he would raise up pastors and teachers, evangelists and prophets in the church. And he did. And we have 2,000 years of history, rich history. And so I was introduced by Ron Frost in particular to historical theology. Sticking with theology still, I did biblical studies still as well. But sticking with the theology side, I was introduced to historical theology, and it gave me perspective that I'd never had before. It kind of got me behind all these ideas that were causing my doubt. And those were just kind of surface level things, symptomatic things, I would say. And I didn't understand the history of ideas behind that. Well, that's what historical theology provided for me. It provided a perspective. I was introduced to Martin Luther, John Calvin, Thomas Aquinas, Irenaeus, Athanasius, Augustine, and so many more. Bernard of Clairvaux, Anselm of Canterbury. I mean, the list goes on. Into the Puritan realm, into English Puritanism. Richard Sibbes, which is who Frost did his work on. John Cotton. I looked into the post-Reformed Orthodox, of course. Not favorably, but critically. William Perkins, William Ames, Theodore Beza, just that whole realm, the Protestant Reformation period, and medieval theology. So not just Reformed theology, not just the magisterial reformers, but also medieval theology itself in the 14th, 15th centuries, 13th century, and then patristic theology. And the Lord used that to open my eyes to a whole new world. And after that, I was introduced to, Karl Barth from Paul Metzger in seminary, and he did his research on Barth's theology of culture, sacred and secular. Well, that whetted my appetite. So I graduated seminary in 2003 with all of this background now, and given the tools that I needed to continue on in my research, my own study. And that's what I've done since then. So I really began to dig into Barth and Thomas Torrance then, which was a student of Karl Barth in Scotland, a Scottish theologian. And I got a hold of them, really started pressing into them, I would say in about 2005, and now it hasn't stopped. I mean, I still am into them big time. And I really got further into Luther and Calvin. I just continued on that trajectory, reading historical theology, reading Karl Barth, reading Thomas Torrance. And those are the primary voices for me. Reading now Athanasius, reading Irenaeus even more. Reading about patristic theology, reading a lot of secondary literature on all of these periods of time. And it's those things that have brought me to where I'm at right now, currently. And so I'm still seeking to grow that way, still seeking to just push further into the kind of Christological focus that Barth and Torrance in particular have provided for me. Without them, I wouldn't really be interested in theology, except for the fact that I love historical theology. But it's because of Barth and Torrance that it's filled in the lines even further for me. They've allowed me to be able to engage historical theology in a very constructive way. And along with that, I've also exposed myself to a lot more modern theology. And I find myself enjoying that greatly because it provides a lot of perspective. Again, to me, perspective is everything. It orients things in a certain way that allows me to think critically, allows me to think constructively. And so the more exposure I can have to all periods of theological history, for me, in my mind, the better. And so looking at the modern period, Schleiermacher, Ritschl, Hermann, some of the voices who impacted Barth, understanding their theology helps me understand my own theology, because I've come to realize, just like all of us, we're all products of our environment. We don't have our ideas, we don't hold our ideas in a vacuum. And so whether we're conscious or not, we've been shaped theologically by certain voices, just by virtue of the period of time in which we live. It's inescapable that no matter how much we might protest against this, it's inescapable that we have been formed by a modern period of theological development. And so I want to understand that. I want to understand those voices. And so again, Barth is such a great guide there, because he engages, he himself obviously is a modern theologian, and he is such a great tour guide, so to speak, and someone who helps me to engage constructively and critically with all periods of theological history, starting with patristic theology all the way into the modern. And so these are some of the voices who have influenced me. I'm going to have to cut this off. Again, I've run out of time. Till next time, I'll talk to you hopefully really soon. Blessings to you.